Coming up on In-Flight Snack, a loaded episode. We have the great Kenny Albert to talk about his career in broadcasting. We also previewed the Jets game as they face off against Joe Flacco and the Cleveland Browns tonight in Cleveland. Before that, I got to tell you, this episode is brought to you by Bet Online, and the only people who don't get time off this time of year are pro athletes, Bilal and I, and Bet Online. With NFL, bowl season, and NBA in full swing over the holidays, BetOnline isn't taking a second off to make sure you have all the up-to-the-second odds, news, and info. BetOnline has all the sports wagering info available you need with both desktop and mobile access. Head there today and get in on the action. And remember to use the promo code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, to receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Again, promo code BELIEVE for a 50% welcome bonus. Bet Online, where the game starts. Welcome back to In-Flight Snack, a New York Jets podcast on the Believe Podcast Network. It's been a pretty wild holiday season. So that's Bilal Powell. I'm Rami Lavi. We still do a podcast together. This is fun. And first thing I got to ask you, because of all the fun videos, looks like you're having a great time over the holiday season. So happy holidays to you and yours. But my favorite video that came out from your wife's social media, and please tell me this wasn't staged, I'm going to be mad, was the video of you drawing up the plays on the shower with the wet marker, drawing up the football plays. Was that natural? Was that just Coach Bilal? You thought of something while in the shower, so you're like, I have to write it down now, otherwise I'm going to forget it? Or
Oh, that was authentic. That was real. Like, listen, we played. So if you don't know, we went down to Naples for the national championship, and we had Dallas. And the thing about this bracket is there was supposed to be a draw. There were 8 teams, but no one wanted to play Dallas. So no one wanted to draw. So we ended up playing Dallas, who was a very good football team. And everyone knows how many athletes they produce down in Dallas. So I had this idea of like how to attack Dallas. So I'm like, you know what? I have to write this down and save it, take a picture, send it to my offensive coaches, and put it in the game plan. So, I had no idea she was, recording me. It was, that was just me being me. Any chance I get, I'm drawing up plays and, my mind's thinking football. So no, it was not staged. It was authentic, man.
That's awesome. And I'm the same way, because whenever I have anything for the podcast or for the radio, I start a group chat with myself it's a specific group chat, so I know where to find it, where I'll just text myself. It's just me in the chat, but I'll text myself like if I think of something, because I know I'm going to forget it. So right away, like at 4:00 in the morning, you could look at this group chat and you'll see that like I texted myself something to ask Kenny today, which coming up, we have Kenny Albert on the podcast. Great guest. We had a really fun time with him. I was in, and I can say this now, one of my pinned pictures on my Instagram is me and Mike Breen. Like broadcasting and broadcasting legends are something that means a lot to me, almost more than the athletes themselves. Sorry, Bilal. So I was like nervous at the beginning, and I wanted to say so much, but I also wanted him to talk. So I hope it came out good. I think it was a good time. So that conversation with Kenny Albert is coming up. We had a great time. You mentioned your play calling and your team. The Jets running back currently is doing some stuff that hasn't been done in a long time. And the stats that I want to bring up, because there are a bunch of stats floating around there, but since week 11, you know that Breece Hall is 5th in the NFL in receptions. Everyone talks about how the Jets are struggling with their, they have no second wide receiver, when meanwhile, it took them till week 11 to figure out that their second to best option in the pass game has been Breece Hall all along.
Absolutely. I mean, that guy's special. He's a special. He should never come off the field. If they don't look at him and say that we have a 3-down back and this guy doesn't come out unless he needs a breather, then they're going to fool themselves. And that what allows you to go out and sign guys like Dalvin Cook. I think you did not need Dalvin Cook. I understand that Breece Hall was coming off of an injury, but this guy does not need to come off the field. Like, you ride this guy. He's the workhorse. He's versatile. I saw and liked the game plan that they had last week. He was lining up as a receiver. He was catching the ball out of the backfield. He was running the ball. And when you do things like that, it creates opportunity. And you saw what the guy can do when you get him in the space. If they can keep him from getting hit in the backfield, that's another statistic we should talk about, right? How many times this guy's being hit in the backfield before he gets through the line of scrimmage? If you can find a way to get him through the line of scrimmage to the second level, he is a very explosive running back.
Yeah, and you mentioned the receiving and the rushing. So there are only a few players in NFL history with multiple games where they had 95 plus rushing yards and 95 plus receiving yards in the same game. Brees has done it twice. Other than that, there's only 4 other guys in NFL history who have done it more than once. Walter Payton's done it 3 times. Other than that, no one's done it more than twice. And so this guy is not just great, he's historically great. And it's kind of, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, oh my God, here we
And
go
that's
again.
22
Another,
games, though. Let's remind people that it's only
yeah,
22 games. All the other guys are 100 game plus.
right. These are guys who played full careers in their league,
Yes, exactly.
It's
So
unbelievable what he's been able to do. But this is another thing where it's like retrospect, right? Hindsight's 2020. And we have another situation like that coming up tonight on Thursday Night Football. The Jets are facing off against a guy who called them a couple weeks into the season, said, I want a job. I played with you guys last year. Bring me in Joe Flacco. There was a picture going around 6 weeks ago of him on a commercial flight. He flew on a commercial flight to Cleveland to get his job there. And now he has as many touchdown passes with Cleveland in the last 6 weeks that the Jets have had all year. He's looked incredible. And Joe Flacco, I mean, this is just typical Jets karma. He's playing against the Jets tonight.
and we'll see. We'll see how that pans out. Like Joe has always been a good quarterback, and obviously that probably would have been the first guy I would have went to as the organization. Joe Flacco, being a veteran, obviously we know what having Aaron Rodgers did to a lot of veteran quarterbacks. A lot of guys probably didn't want to come here because of that. But when Aaron Rodgers went down, that probably would have been one of the first guys that I would have went and got. And now that he has his opportunity, and Cleveland Browns, they have a history with this man. They know what he did in Baltimore twice a year versus that Cleveland Browns defense. So, they had a, somewhat of a relationship. So hats off to Joe and, what he's doing in that organization. I think right now, this is the 4th quarterback of the year right now in Cleveland.
Yep.
And he's doing a good job. So you got to take your hat off to a guy like that.
Yeah, you talk about these quarterback contracts. So Deshaun Watson not really working out that well because Joe Flacco's outplaying him, which is crazy after they gave all that guaranteed money. Another guy who got a huge contract who's going to be benched this week is Russell Wilson. And I was thinking the announcement's going to come that he's going to be cut after the season. That's what they've said. So, he's familiar with the Nate Hackett system, right? Maybe we should bring him in as the backup next year.
He would not come here as a backup.
I'm kidding. I'm just playing.
You know that's Russell Wilson. He will not come here as a backup. Man.
Yeah, especially after how last year went with Nate Hackett. But hey, familiar with the system. It's so funny because I listen to a lot of Jets content and they've kind of shifted to if they're drafting 6th or they're drafting 8th, who should they get? And I just can't do a show like that. I want to have more fun. I don't want to be doom and gloom. I don't know about you, but to me, it's like, hey, we're going to still have fun. That's why we had a great conversation with Kenny. But there was an announcement that really drove me insane. And if I can be negative for a second, Woody Johnson, the announcement before the game that this is a do-over, the Brian Costello report, and next year's just a do-over and running it back, I think is directly correlated to them blowing that lead in that game because there's zero accountability. And competition, like Derek Jeter says, competition eliminates complacency. But when there's no competition and there's no one pushing you for your job and you're safe, we get a do-over next year. First of all, where's my do-over? Where do I sign up for the refund for the season tickets for the do-over? But when there's no competition, you become complacent. And when you have a 27-7 lead and you just start, hey, let's just run this game out. We have this game won. We're not going to take any risks anymore. You become complacent and you start to lose the football game. Like, can you speak to the lack of accountability correlating directly to losing with this franchise?
Yeah, you don't want to see this late in the season, guys folding. And you're talking about the Commanders that we jumped up on. It should have been okay. We jumped up. We're not used to being in this situation, so now let's learn how to finish. And the New York Jets did not finish that game. Obviously, they won the field goal with a field goal, but there's so many different factors that they have to learn in that organization. One, they have to learn how to play from behind. They have to learn how to finish when they're up. And honestly, I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing it from an evaluation standpoint. And when I ask myself, when you hear about Woody Johnson talking about bringing back those two guys, Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh, saying for a redo, a do-over, how big is the margin between bringing those guys back for a safe spot and then just saying, hey, let's clean house and start over? They've had 3 years, 4 years now to figure that out. So how big is the margin of losing the general manager and the head coach, clearing house, figuring out someone that can come in and help you win right now, because they have 4 years to do it. Is it 4 years, I think? 4 years, right? They
Yep.
have 4
Yep.
years to do it, to do this. So how big is that margin of saying, "Hey, I want to clear house, start all over." That's the real redo in keeping these guys and saying, "Okay, how do we build from here?" Because we've seen a pattern of behavior. One is losing late in the season, right? Not finding a way to win when it really counted. We're talking about those divisional games and those big games, the games that they should win that they can't find a way to win. There's a pattern here. So at what point in ownership do I look at it and say, okay, sorry, how big is the margin of losing my GM and restarting GM head coach to saying, hey, it's going to be safe. I don't want to rebuild. Let's just do a redo. Like, how big is that margin?
It's crazy. And in games facing, you mentioned like the finding ways to win late in the year. In games when they were facing playoff elimination under Robert Saleh, 3 years, right? They've been eliminated from the playoffs 3 times. So in those games when they had the chance to either keep their hopes alive or they're eliminated with a loss, they lost 30-9 against the Saints, 23-6 against the Seahawks, and 30-0 against the Dolphins. That's 3 blowouts, being outscored 83-15 in 3 games that were the most important games, arguably, of Saleh's coaching career. And that's just not good enough. And yet, with all that, I say load up for next season. Run it back with Aaron Rodgers. It's the best option, because if you want to break the drought, the playoff drought, the best course of action is to run it back, because if you start a rebuild now, it's going to be a couple years. And who said they're going to bring in the right people for the rebuild? So you have, it's almost like they left themselves no choice. They have to run it back with Rodgers, and you could be in a worse position. Like, Rodgers
But
changes
Rodgers and
everything.
who, though? Rodgers, head coach and GM?
It doesn't matter. To me, you see how important the having that star quarterback is. And if Rodgers is 85% of what he was in his last 2 MVP seasons in Green Bay, I still believe they could win a Super Bowl in the next couple of years. If they load up, if they go out and they try and load up on picks and free agents this year, this summer, I don't know. I mean, what's a better plan than that?
Uh, I like it. I
Yeah, I'm
do,
almost
but
positive about it. I'm putting too much stock in Rodgers.
I like it,
I
but
can't wait for us to have a show where we're actually talking about Rodgers playing football games. We never did that.
and not standing on the sideline and
Yeah.
throwing
We
pregame.
talked about
Yeah,
so much crap this year and never talked about like actual fun football stuff.
yeah, and that's tough. And I think right now, let's fix what's in front of us. Let's not be delusional. Let's not like go get things. I don't want to hear, oh, I picked this player in the draft because he was the best available player.
Oh, Bill
I've
McConnell.
heard that before, and we don't need that. We need the best player that's going to help us win the needs that we need, right? We don't want the best available player. I think attack the free agency. You attack the free agency, fix what's in front of you. What needs to be fixed? The offensive line.
Yep.
I think Garrett Wilson needs help on the other side. You need to go get a veteran receiver on the other side of Garrett Wilson.
Yep.
That's the truth. Like you talked about the games that Zach did hit his targets. They were dropping footballs.
Yep.
Guys
Yeah.
that we needed to help Garrett Wilson from a receiving core. So McCole Hardman gets signed, you don't use them. So like we don't need to bring in empty space. We need to really bring in guys, one who's used to winning, right? And if they're not used to winning in the organization, they're always top in their position. Like you need to go find that type of guy. And then honestly, I'll have to be honest with you. I think you go find you a decent quarterback in the draft. You go find
Yep.
you a decent quarterback in the draft, someone that can come in and hopefully have an entire year under Aaron Rodgers. And I think Zach Wilson is clocked out from this organization from some of the comments and the demeanor. Maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe I'm just assuming, but I think he wants out of New York. I do.
Yeah,
And
he's
go
out of
find
here,
somebody else.
and yeah, and I think they're, shelving him I don't think we're going to see him again this year. I think, obviously concussion or not, I'm not going to speculate, but I think they're just put him aside and like, hey, we'll figure it out in the
Figure it
offseason.
out
We'll
in
get him out
March.
of here.
Yeah.
We promised him we'll get him out of here. Another guy who's going to be out of here is Mekhi Becton, making business decisions the last couple of weeks. Nearly got Zach Wilson killed in that game because he's like, there's
He
one
looks
thing to
lazy.
be bad.
I mentioned that to my
There's
wife. I'm
zero
sorry.
effort. It's
It's
so
bad.
lazy.
The effort is horrible.
And this guy has a
And the iron of
pattern
sky
of
do
being
not lie.
lazy. Yeah.
It does not lie. It does not lie. The iron of sky does not lie. And if he thinks other teams aren't looking at this film, or if there is some turnaround in the building that uh someone's not going to be evaluating film, then he's fooling himself. And he's
Yeah,
pushing
he's not
himself
gonna get a
out of the
job in this
league.
league.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. He's pushing himself out of the league if he's not assuming that someone is evaluating his effort. And and
and Aaron
and and,
Rodgers.
and this is the best time to do that, to interview, is to say, how is this guy playing, knowing that we don't have playoff hopes? That's what
Yep.
they're looking at. Who's gonna be here when we're winning, and who's gonna be here when we're losing. That's gonna dictate your character. And this is a very small league, Makai. People talk. And
Yeah.
listen, you're one bad word or negative thought or negative word away from being out of this league. And that's the truth.
Yeah, what's so interesting is Rodgers gave him every opportunity where Aaron put his arm around him both literally and figuratively and tried to bring him back this year. And the second like they were, the going got tough, he's like, "All right, I'm out again." And that's just a terrible look. You mentioned interview, so we had a great interview with Kenny Albert. So I'm going to kick it to that now. Here is Kenny Albert. We had an awesome conversation with him. All right, joining us now on In Flight Snack. This is an absolute honor and pleasure to have you on, the voice of the NHL, NBA, MLB, NFL, and of course the Olympics. Kenny Albert, this is absolutely incredible to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you guys.
I had a first question. This is an interesting question because this is maybe a little bit of a different direction than what you're used to. But a lot of people probably ask you about your father. I want to ask you about your grandfather. Do you know what your grandfather did for a living?
On my father's side, my grandfather owned a grocery store in Brooklyn with his brother. And I recall going there on a couple of occasions. One time when I was about 7 or 8 years old, he put me to work stamping some of the prices on the various food items. So that was the family business on my grandfather's side, and definitely have some memories from back in my early years visiting the store.
So I was out to dinner last night. This is how it came up. I was out to dinner with my grandmother last night, and she said, "Yeah, of course, the Alberts from Africhtig, which is where my grandfather or her father, my great grandfather, apparently worked." So apparently,
Wow.
my great grandfather worked at that store. So,
Wow. Wow,
so
that was the name of the store. That was
yep.
their last name up until the early 60s. So that's a crazy connection. I guess our grandparents worked together back in the day.
I didn't know this till last night, but yeah, crazy connection. So I promised my grandmother I'd ask you if you know how to cut locks.
Not personally, no, but I'm sure my grandfather did a great job with it.
All right, Bilal, we'll let you ask the sports questions. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, we talk about highlighting our life, Kenny, and we talk about prime time. And, when I first came in the league, I used to always hear about Thursday night games. Guys complained about Thursday night games. So, just from your standpoint, being in the business, covering multiple NFL games, which night is really prime time night? Is it Monday, Thursday, or Sunday night that's prime time?
Well, that's a great question, Bilal. When I was growing up, and I'm older than you guys, Monday Night Football was the thing. That was the one national game every week. Even in the other sports, you had Monday Night Baseball, you had games of the week in basketball and hockey. And again, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, we didn't have cable TV. It was in its infancy. There was no satellite TV. You really could only see your local teams. And when I would watch football on a Sunday afternoon, it was the Jets and the Giants. That was it. If I watched baseball, it was the Mets and the Yankees, aside from that one national game, Monday Night Football, Monday Night Baseball. And then cable TV came around, and the Thursday night package came into play, and Sunday night eventually. So, I think these days, Sunday night has sort of become the game that has the best matchups consistently throughout the season. I think this year they've evened the playing field a little bit with some of the Monday and Thursday night games, but um, I think over the last 10 or 15 years, it's become Sunday night football. It's the culmination of the long day, watching 1 o'clock games, 4 o'clock games, and then that terrific matchup at night. But with the introduction of Thursday night football, you now have those 3 nights of the week where the entire country is focusing on the NFL. And I know last year, I think it was 82 of the top 100 watched TV programs in the United States were NFL football, whether at 1 o'clock, 4 o'clock, Thursday night, Sunday night, Monday night. So people have so many more choices these days. That's why the overall ratings maybe aren't as high. The numbers aren't as high as they were back in the 80s and 90s because you didn't have computers and iPads and other devices and other electronics to keep people distracted. But as far as the number, the 82 out of 100, it's still it's the best reality TV, right? Sports, and in particular the NFL. And fortunately for the fans, they have a lot of nights to choose from. But I think Sunday night, that's sort of become the biggest game of the week matchup wise for the most part.
You talked about how the industry has changed. One of the things when you were coming up, I know this, trying to grow in this industry. Bilal now knows this, trying to grow in this industry. It's tough, but maybe when you were coming up in the industry, it was even tougher. You didn't have the internet. You couldn't just put yourself out there. How do you think that's changed as a broadcaster, someone in media, how the landscape has changed, people trying to make a career out of sports and media?
Right. It's huge. When I was in college, for example, at NYU in New York, we broadcasted the men's and women's basketball games. We had a terrific Division III sports program, and there were about 5 or 6 of us every year at the radio station. So it allowed us to get great experience in all roles: play-by-play, color analyst, producer, statistician, engineer. We all rotated jobs, but we had to fight for the airtime with the music department, with the DJs who wanted their shows on the air because the radio station was the only outlet. Once the internet came into play about a decade later, and I speak to a lot of broadcasting students, high school and college age, at sportscasting camps every summer. And that's one of the things I mentioned to them is that when you go to college now, even in high school, there are so many high schools have terrific broadcasting programs, but in college, you don't necessarily need the radio station to do play-by-play, for example, and put your work out there. You can go broadcast a soccer game or a volleyball match on the internet, put it out on the website. You could do podcasts. So there are so many more opportunities now. A lot of the college conferences, the ACC, the Big Ten, and many others have their own networks where the students can get involved as well. So as technology continues to evolve, a lot more opportunities out there for youngsters looking to get into the business.
Kenny, speaking of the technology and being able to get on social media, Rami and I talked about it a few weeks ago, how this generation have better access than we did. We didn't know what our favorite athlete was doing throughout the day. Now you can get online, you can see the training, you can see their lifestyle, and you can kind of follow your favorite athlete. So along the way of your career and doing what you do for your job and removing the bias, all right, I have to ask you this question. Who's your favorite athlete of all time, and what moment made that athlete your favorite athlete?
Well, you're right, Bilal. With social media, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, I don't know much about TikTok, although I have 2 daughters, so they can certainly.
I'm the same.
There are not many secrets, right? You could have a photo taken of you anywhere. You can post from anywhere. Again, a lot different from when I was growing up, and and there are a lot of positives to it as well. But as far as favorite athletes, the 2 that come to mind, and there are many others, but throughout my career, broadcasting and doing interviews and meeting with players, Wayne Gretzky and Brett Favre were the 2 guys that stood out as the most, down to earth superstars. And I would include Peyton Manning and Eli Manning and many others in the conversation. But Wayne Gretzky is a guy who I watched while I was growing up, dominated his sport, best hockey player of all time, but whenever you're around him, you would never get that sense. And I've been real fortunate now, working NHL on TNT over the last 3 years. He's become a colleague, and during the playoffs, the entire pregame crew travels, so I've spent a lot of time around him. And he actually was one of the uh, two folks who wrote the foreword to my book, which came out a couple of months ago, along with Walt Clyde Frazier. So that's kind of surreal to see their names on the cover, but just a regular down to earth guy. Brett Favre called so many of his games through the years, mostly in Green Bay, and then a couple, later on with Minnesota and the Jets. And when we broadcast NFL games, we normally go in on Friday to the home team practice and watch practice, and then get to sit down with 4 or 5 players and coaches. And he was the same way. You never got the sense that he was a superstar. He'd sit there and talk to you for as long as you needed. And a lot of it wasn't even about football. It was about hunting and fishing and his family, etc. Um, Peyton Manning the same way. He has a photographic memory. He would go through plays. He would remember the exact play call from a game 6 years ago if it came up. And the thing that impressed me about Peyton, he would always remember your name. If you met him once and then didn't see him for 3 or 4 years, he would address you by your first name. So, like I said, there are many others as well, but those are the initial names that come to mind.
You mentioned the NHL on TNT. How difficult is it to go from calling a game for MSG and calling a Rangers game, and then now you have to call a national game for the Rangers, and you kind of have to hide those biases a little bit? Is that like a transition that's difficult?
Well, I guess I'm used to it from many years, calling NHL games on NBC as well. The football and baseball that I do are all national games, so that issue really doesn't come up. And then I work about 15 Knicks games on MSG. But you're right, with hockey, I call the Rangers on the radio and then NHL on TNT. So I do have to remind myself when I have a national game involving the Rangers that you have to get just as excited when the opposition scores a goal. You have to treat it right down the middle, 50-50. But I think from so many years of doing it, it's not really an issue. I'm sure there are fans out there. I'll see it on social media if I'm doing a football game. You hear it from fans on both sides that think you're rooting against their team, and that's not the case. We're not rooting when we do NFL games. We're not rooting for either team. We call it down the middle. I've worked with color analysts who have played for a particular team, and I know for a fact from spending so much time around them, they're not rooting when they're on the air. So fans are certainly entitled to their opinion. But to get back to the initial question, I do have to remind myself if it's a Rangers national game that you do have to call it a little bit differently than working their games on the radio side.
With Vilma, I think he was getting some hate from the Giants Saints game. I saw that. I'm like, there's no way that he's not rooting for the Saints.
No, he's not. And I worked with Moose Johnston for many years, and the Eagles fans would give it to him if we were calling an Eagles Dallas game, but they're all professionals and they're not going to do anything to risk their job, obviously. So, you definitely associate players with certain teams. If Troy Aikman's working a Cowboys game, for example, or Tony Romo's working a Cowboys game, but at this point, they're broadcasters and they're studying all week. They're watching film. They're going into the practices and having the meetings with the players and coaches that I talked about. So, they're certainly calling it right down the middle.
Kenny, I'm a huge fan of being able to watch sports live, and you have the opportunity now to do this, for a few decades, and with that amount of time throughout sports, we know the games have evolved, and so for how much has each sport changed over the career that you've had, and is it obvious? Right now you're looking at the NFL. It used to be back in the day, it was power football, pro football, running the football. Now it's about passing. You're starting to see running backs catch the ball out of the backfield. So on the other sports, just elaborate about how each sport has changed, just from you covering sports over the past few decades.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in football specifically, and I just mentioned Troy Aikman, but when you look back at his stats, for example, during those 3 Cowboys Super Bowl runs in the early to mid 90s, they were primarily a running team with Emmitt Smith, right? He's the all-time leading rusher. And obviously they had Michael Irvin and, some other skilled players, but his stats certainly didn't stand out like the quarterbacks that we see today. And he was one of the all-time greats, a Hall of Famer, but he wasn't throwing for 4,000 or 5,000 yards per season because it was primarily a run game, like you said. I think instant replay has been a big change. When I started doing NFL games, that did not exist, in the form that it does now. So every play is under such scrutiny. Back then, you were relying on the the real time calls, the eyes of the officials, and they were right 98 to 99% of the time. But now with replay, obviously, it's a different ball game as far as close plays that might go the other way as far as what was the initial call. I think in hockey, I think just again the players are probably bigger, faster, stronger. Back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they would go to training camp to get in shape, probably in all sports, right? Now you have to be in shape, and it's a year-round process. You see players working out throughout the off season, whether it's football, hockey, basketball. I think again with technology, things have evolved, the workout methods, etc. And I also think because of the salaries now, it's a much bigger business. And back in the day, players had jobs in the off season, back in the 50s and 60s, just to supplement their salary. Now, obviously, for the most part, they don't have to do that. But there was 6 or 7 preseason games in football. Then they went down to 4. Now it's 3. So can you imagine playing 7 preseason games in 1 year? I mean, it's almost unheard of for this generation. But I think also on the TV side, the technology. When I started at Fox in '94, David Hill was the president of Fox Sports. Rupert Murdoch brought him over from Australia and England, where he had been working, and he was the first to implement the score and time box up in the left-hand corner. Before that, you would turn a game on television and a graphic would pop up every couple of minutes with the score and time. And starting with Fox in '94, you had that permanently. So on the technology side, things are changing for the better each and every year as well.
Was this something you always wanted to do since you were growing up? Kind of like, I mean, my father's an orthodontist. I never was interested in teeth. Your father was doing this. Sometimes it goes the opposite, where it's like, oh, I don't want to do what he's doing. Or did you admire him the way the rest of New York did and was like, I want to be like him?
No, I always did. Right from an early age, my parents gave me a tape recorder for my birthday when I was about 5 years old, and I started announcing games into the recorder in my bedroom. And then when I was old enough, I would start taking it to games. And it is really all that I ever wanted to do. I did a lot of writing in high school and college, covered sports for the various newspapers, but I was always practicing play-by-play, and it was just so much fun. I would tag along with him to games and bring friends, and who wouldn't love going to sporting events and sitting in the broadcast booth and sitting in great seats. So it's something I always wanted to do. When I was in high school, a real big break in 10th grade, growing up on Long Island, Cox Cable in a neighboring town came to my school to film a girls' basketball game. They had 2 cameras, a little production van, and that was it. And I volunteered. I met the producer. I volunteered to announce the game. They clipped a microphone onto my shirt, and the people sitting around me in the stands probably thought I was crazy, talking to myself for about an hour and a half. And then I spoke to the producer, the late Roy Menton, the next day on the phone, and he gave me the opportunity over the next 2.5 years to broadcast about, I would say, 75 to 100 high school and even some Division III college games all over Long Island. And it was just an invaluable experience. I would do everything: football, baseball, basketball, hockey, lacrosse, soccer. And I would bring friends along as color analysts. And I felt like I had a head start because back then you couldn't really do this in high school. You had to wait until college. So I had 2.5 years of experience doing play-by-play. And then, as I mentioned, in college, calling NYU basketball games. And then my first job was broadcasting minor league hockey down in Baltimore. And that was 2 years I would never trade in for anything. Just getting the reps, 80 games a year, often by myself without a color analyst. And then everybody in the office would have to chip in with PR and marketing and sales and go pick up a player at the airport, really whatever was needed. So I was 22, 23, 24 years old at the time, but such a great learning experience, riding the buses, 6, 8, 10-hour bus rides with the team, and just gaining that experience doing the play-by-play and getting the reps.
Kenny, Rami and I were talking about before you got on about how you followed in your dad's footsteps, and then he was like, "Hey, I wasn't planning on following my dad's footsteps," and we kind of made a joke out of it. And sometimes our job and our career is so demanding, and sometimes you need a laugh. Can you take us through one of the funniest moments, calling a game or throughout your career that you can remember, live on air?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. I was calling a hockey game, Bilal, in Los Angeles on the radio years and years ago, and I started to feel the hiccups coming on. And we have a cough button. It's called the cough button in front of us. If you want to turn off the microphone, you hit the button. But with the hiccups, sometimes you don't expect it. So I would try to reach for it each and every time. And I think, I was able to. My timing was perfect during that little episode with the hiccups. When I worked with Tony Siragusa, the late Tony Siragusa, and Moose Johnston for 8 years, so many great memories, many funny moments on the air with Goose, and we called a number of your games, back then. But off the air, a lot of the memories, when I think back to the most fun times, Goose was a guy who, and you didn't play against him. You were about a decade late, but I'm sure you heard stories about him as a player with the Ravens, with that defense, with Ray Lewis and all those guys that won the Super Bowl in 2000. First of all, he was a really smart guy. You might look at him and he had that, that persona and that character. It was a lot different than what you got. He knew a little bit about everything and learned so much from him, and really studied film, as a player. And even when we would watch film together, he would always point out something that the rest of us would never see. So, he would notice the finger of an offensive lineman and figure out if it was a run play or a pass play. But a lot of the things we did off the air, we'd be in town for a broadcast from Friday morning through Sunday through the game, and we had some free time on Saturday before we would go meet with the visiting team. And Goose never liked sitting around. He always had to be doing something. So depending on the city, if we were in Buffalo for a Bills game, we'd go on a jet boat ride in Niagara Falls and get soaked and, go through that whole experience. We had a Saints game. We took a swamp boat tour in Louisiana. We pet baby alligators. The only time I ever held a gun, we went to a gun range in Dallas and shot at targets. That was with Moose and Goose. We rode race cars 140 miles an hour in Charlotte. I was in the passenger seat. A professional drove the car, but so he would always want to do something fun. So a lot of the memories are actually from those years working with Moose and Goose, who are both Super Bowl champions, great players, great people. And unfortunately, we lost Goose about a year and a half ago. But as far as other moments on the air, one of the stories I tell in my book, I was working as the sideline reporter and post-game host in the locker room. 2003, the Yankees Red Sox American League Championship Series. It was the game in which Aaron Boone hit the home run in Game 7 to send the Yankees into the World Series. And I was in the Yankee clubhouse after the game during the trophy presentation and doing the interviews with Joe Torre and some of the players. And it was late. It was like 1 a.m. The game went long, and I was done with the interviews. I sent it back up to the booth to Joe Buck and Tim McCarver, and then they wound up throwing it to the late local news. And out of the corner of my eye, as I'm finishing up, I see Mayor Bloomberg, the New York mayor at the time, and he kind of looks like he wants to be interviewed next. But at that point, we were off the air, and there was a PR person with him who came over to me and whispered, "Would you mind interviewing the mayor next?" And I said, "Well, unfortunately, we're off the air." And the PR guy said, "Can you fake it?" He didn't want to lose his job. So he asked me to do a fake interview with the mayor of New York, which I did. I went up to the cameraman. I said, "Look, can you make it look like you're filming this, even though we're not really on the air?" And the mayor came up, and I knew that he had grown up in Boston. His mom was a Red Sox fan. So I started formulating questions in my mind and did a 5-minute interview with the mayor that never went anywhere. on television. So
How long
that
before
that's one of the
he
favorite
figured that out?
stories. That's one of the favorite stories that I wrote about in the book.
How long before he actually figured that out? Does he still not know?
I don't know if he ever found out about it, to be honest.
You mentioned the Yankees, you mentioned Baltimore. So I had the opportunity to work with John Sterling on the Yankees radio network this summer, and he mentioned his career also. He had a big part of it was in Baltimore, starting off there, and I worked in Baltimore at the Fan before working at the Fan here for a couple of years. And one of the most poignant things, and I just wanted to bring it up because you mentioned it, was I was producing the afternoon drive show. We were outside Camden Yards at Pickles Pub in Baltimore, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Well,
Yeah, and I was producing for Ken Wyman and Jason Lockenfor on Afternoon Drive in Baltimore, and I got a text from my program director that Goose had passed, and I had to relay the message to them for them to announce it on air. And the rest of the show, it happened right at about 2 o'clock when we went on air. And the 4 hour show, we had a whole show planned. The 4 hour show became just constant calls of people telling Goose stories and everyone calling in the rest of the 4 hours. And it was one of the most incredible shows because it was just natural. It was just so raw and pure. And it was such a cool thing to see for me, just seeing how much the city cared about him, how much the broadcasters who were hosting the show cared about him. So, and it wasn't like sad story. It felt like a celebration of his life. You know, it was so many fun, funny stories. So if you had one Goose story that stood out in your mind, what would it be?
well, first of all, ironically, I was texting with Jason Lockenfor that day as well. I was on vacation, and when he heard the news, he texted me. I've known Jason. He was a Baltimore Skipjack season ticket holder, believe it or not, with his family. He was a high school student at the time, and
I believe it.
he would come visit the radio booth when I was working in Baltimore. So you must have worked with my guy Jerry Coleman.
I did. I did. Yep. He always mentioned you.
Yeah, we first met back in 1990 when I moved to Baltimore, and we wound up doing a talk show together back in 91, 92, along with Jerry and Nestor Aparicio in Baltimore. So
Yep.
pretty small world. As far as Goose, aside from the stories that I just told, one of the other things about him is if you were in his inner circle, he would do anything for you. He was so generous, and I saw that, witnessed it on numerous occasions. Um, and even after his passing, one of his business partners, Dirk Vandersteer, who owns Titan Aviation, it's a private jet company, they formed a charity. It's called Goose Flights, and they actually started it while Goose was still alive, and they've continued it in his honor. And his kids, Tony's kids, work for Titan Aviation in various capacities. They fly Make-A-Wish children around the country to various events, and they also fly retired NFL players to medical appointments in other cities. So they've continued Goose's legacy with Goose Flights. But so many stories, and I actually tell a lot of them in the book. 8 years together, you become like family. We would work 18 or 20 weeks together during the NFL season, times 8 years. That's 160 weekends that we were all together from Friday through Sunday, having a lot of meals together. We worked a Giants Buffalo game. It was in 2007, before the Giants run to their first Super Bowl against the Patriots. Ahmad Bradshaw had the 88-yard touchdown run. You might remember the game, in a hailstorm. And that was actually the only game Goose came up to the booth. He was normally down in the field, but due to the weather, he came upstairs. We all wound up driving home. All the flights were canceled. Those of us who live in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area, we piled into two cars, and we wound up meeting up at a rest stop along the thruway. And the car that Goose was in got there first. And when I walked in with Fran Morrison, who I know you had on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, he was in my car, and our director Mike Frank, Goose had ordered about $200 worth of French fries. I've never seen so many French fries piled up on the table. But he was ready for us when we got there midway through that drive. So I was also so honored. I wound up doing the eulogy at his funeral. His family had asked me to put some words together, and that was probably one of the biggest honors of my life, to be honest. There were about 1,500 people there. I remember looking down and seeing so many Hall of Famers, Ray Lewis and Shannon Sharp and Rod Woodson and so many others. But just to be able to speak for about 10 minutes was a huge honor.
That's awesome. Speaking of, you're having these moments and you're going all the way back, just highlighting your entire career. Kenny, if you had the opportunity to speak to your younger self, what advice would you give yourself coming into this industry?
Again, great question. I think one of the biggest things I learned from being around sportscasters, my father, my uncles, others in the business, I learned the preparation. That was the most important aspect. Just the hours and hours that go into it. There's a lot of work and travel. I'll be flying to Seattle later tonight. And I'm preparing for 3 different sports. I have a football game Sunday, a hockey game, outdoor hockey game Monday, the Winter Classic, and then a basketball game back in New York on Wednesday. So I really did learn at a young age the value of the preparation, getting organized, looking ahead, working ahead, so you're never doing anything at the last minute. But if I had to, as my younger self, if I had to speak looking ahead, I think I would just say to try to enjoy each and every minute, which I think I've been able to do. Fortunately, I have a great family. My wife, we joke we've been married for 27 years, but I've only been here for 13 of them. But she's so great about the schedule, and our kids are 20 and 24, and they were all used to it. It was similar to my upbringing, to be honest, with my father on the road and working a lot. But I thought it was the greatest thing to be able to go to these games and try and follow in the footsteps and just learn along the way. And my family was the same way. We might not have, I might not have been around as much as some other parents, but I tried to do a lot of the things during the week. For example, I was always away on weekends, but during the week I might have a game at night, but during the day I try to drive and pick up from school as much as possible, go to the weekday activities. So we actually made it into a positive. So I think I would just tell myself to enjoy it. It's hard to believe it's 30 plus years now, which is crazy. I feel like I just moved down to Baltimore for that first job with the Skipjacks in 1990, but here we are 33 years later.
It's incredible. And one thing that's incredible, I think that stands out about your career is your consistency throughout all 4 major sports. Some people generally, I don't know, pick a lane or stick to it. And Boomer Esiason always says, whenever we talk on the air about the great broadcasters, he says, well, Kenny, because he does all sports. And he you're the first name out of his mouth every single time. I don't know if you know that or not, but he always says because he does every sport. And so that's something, I don't know if that's something you chose. But if you had to give a Mount Rushmore and talk about that a little bit also about why you chose to do all the sports, and obviously the book of Mike for All Seasons, that kind of tells it all. But if you had to give your Mount Rushmore of one from each sport, one greatest broadcaster at each sport, you can't include yourself. Who would it be?
Wow. I've never been asked that question before. That's a good one. And I've heard some of Boomer's kind words. He's a good friend. I worked his charity game for about 20 years. He does such an unbelievable job, raising funds for cystic fibrosis. And he put together a Long Island against New York City high school all-star football game every June from the late 90s until, I guess, right before COVID. And I would call that game almost every year with Marty Lyons and Mike Quick, and so many great memories. As far as calling different sports, I've always loved the variety. I saw my father do it when I was growing up. My goal, though, was to do hockey on the radio. That was what I wanted to do throughout high school, college, early years, calling the minor league games. But in high school, as I mentioned earlier, had the opportunity to do so many different sports. And I write a lot about this in the book. So I started doing hockey in Baltimore, and then I was hired in Washington by the Capitals. So I was doing primarily hockey for those first 3 or 4 years. When I started at Home Team Sports in Washington with the Capitals, they also did Bullets basketball, now the Wizards. They did Orioles baseball. So I had the opportunity to fill in on some games when the regular broadcaster had another event or had to miss a game for a personal reason. And then Fox, Rupert Murdoch, makes this crazy bid for the NFL prior to the 94 season. And a number of us, Joe Buck, Tom Brenneman, Kevin Harlan, we were all hired, 4 young play-by-play announcers in 94. We were really in the right place at the right time. And none of us ever thought we would ever be doing NFL football, especially at such a young age. So it was the perfect storm. in 94 when Fox started with the NFL. And then I also started working some other sports. So I always loved the variety. And then by virtue of the networks that I work for, so I'm doing football for Fox, and then they acquired Major League Baseball rights. I started doing baseball as well with MSG, doing the Rangers on the radio. But for the last 12 or 13 years, I've done about 15 Knicks games on TV when Mike Breen has a national assignment. So it's all kind of worked out. It's a jigsaw puzzle of a schedule. As far as the Mount Rushmore, I think you have to go with Vin Scully on baseball, Doc Emmerich on hockey. Although I don't want to leave anyone out, there have been so many great ones. Al Michaels is a personal favorite of mine on football. And I guess, can I go with a family member on basketball? You probably have to, I would put my father up there. Mike Breen's unbelievable. So that would probably be the Mount Rushmore in each of the 4 sports.
2 names, if I can, just John Miller. I mean, growing up, he did Sunday Night Baseball for me, and that was like, to me, that was something incredible.
One of the best parts about moving to Baltimore was getting to listen to John Miller every day on the Orioles back in the early 90s. Because again, back then, no satellite, no cable. He was on Sunday Night Baseball eventually for many years on ESPN. But I once had John on as a guest. So he came to a Skipjacks game in Baltimore, minor league hockey team I was working for. I had met him at an Orioles game, and I wound up leaving tickets for John and his family, and he was kind enough to come on as a guest in between periods with us.
Incredible. And with John, I think listening to him, I called it broadcasting school. I would listen to him just because he's so incredible. The other one is a local guy, This Is the Jets podcast, Bob Wischusen, so good on the Jets radio. And then he also does, I guess if you guys don't have on TNT, don't have the Stanley Cup final, I'm rooting, and maybe it's my personal bias, I'm rooting for Bob to get a chance to do the Cup final on ESPN.
Yeah, Bob does a great job. He used to work with us at MSG. He would do a lot of the Ranger games that I missed. Bob is a part of the exclusive list. And I wrote about this in the book. Again, he's worked all 4 major sports doing play-by-play. There's about 10 or 12 of us who are on that list through the years. Bob does a great job with the Jets. He does hockey on ESPN, as you mentioned. And he's done some basketball at MSG and on ESPN through the years. And he also did some baseball games when he worked at WFAN. So Bob's one of the best out there for sure.
This is for either one of you guys, because I know this is a Jets podcast. So the most memorable Jets game that I think that you called was Bilal's rookie year, the Victor Cruz 99-yard touchdown. If either of you have just a specific memory from that game, it kind of catapulted the Giants season to a Super Bowl, and the Jets season went the opposite direction. Kenny, are you a Jets fan? Let's be honest here.
So growing up, I was a Jets and a Giants fan. They barely ever played each other. And I also, they were the only games I would get on TV. So I rooted for both local teams, but I did go to a lot of Jets games. I didn't go to too many Giants games as a youngster, but the Jets still played at Shea Stadium when I was growing up on Long Island. So I would take the train, and I have great memories of watching, the Sack Exchange, Gastineau, Klecko, Lyons, Salam, Richard Todd at quarterback. So I was probably a little bit more of a Jets fan than a Giants fan, just because I went to a lot of those games back in the 80s.
That's a good answer, Kenny. That's a good one.
Yeah, the game you referenced, though, I was working that game with Moose and Goose, and I'm sure Bilal doesn't have great memories due to the result, but
neither do I.
It was one of the iconic plays that I've had the pleasure of calling through my broadcast career, and it was just the anniversary the other day, so I saw some videos were posted online on social media of that 99-yard touchdown.
Yeah, and just I remember just like yesterday when Victor Cruz caught that pass and just stepped away from our defense, and I'm like, I can't believe this. I cannot believe this. And then to watch them, get in and then run the table, that was one of those games where if we win, we get in from each side. So, I always have this, I don't know, this feeling when I, seen that Super Bowl. I was in Tampa with my boy Ahmad Black. He played with the Buccaneers, and we watched the Super Bowl, and I'm like, I cannot believe I'm watching the Giants play in the Super Bowl. It should have been us. It should have been us, right? So, yeah, I don't have too many good memories from that game.
You talk about that game, they end up running the table. The unpredictability of sports, does that keep it fresh for you? Like Joe Flacco is starting against the Jets this week for the Browns tonight. It's unbelievable. Does that keep it like always changing for you?
It does. You never know what's going to happen. Like I said earlier, sports is the best reality TV. I had the Raiders Patriots game last year with the crazy play,
Oh,
Chandler Jones at the end, the laterals. So you just never know what you might see. We had a great Minnesota Detroit game last Sunday. Lions clinched the division. We have a Seattle Pittsburgh this coming Sunday. Both teams still alive. So hopefully some more great memories.
I was on the way to Sunday Night Football watching that Raiders game in the back, Raiders Patriots in the backseat of my parents' car. It was Giants Washington on Sunday Night Football, and it was Hanukkah, so we were going to watch that game before I worked an overnight that night at the Fan in Baltimore. Last question, because this has been going on, and I really appreciate your time. Your schedule is obviously incredibly busy. And I know you could go on for hours. Obviously, the book is A Mike for All Seasons. I do want to ask about Clyde and Wayne Gretzky. So if you want to throw a couple of their stories in, sure. But this has been going around the last couple of days. Is one of my favorite athletes today is Chris Kreider. How does he rank in the all-time great Rangers?
I was just having this discussion with somebody yesterday. It's remarkable when you look at his current statistics, the number of games he's played with the team, the goals, assists, the points, the power play goals. It's pretty much even with Adam Graves, who has his number hanging from the rafters. He's been a terrific Ranger, came in during the playoffs in 2012. He's in the top, 10 now in points. He's in the top 4 in goals, top 5 in power play goals. So I think whenever the career comes to an end, and it might not be for another 4 or 5 years, I think you certainly have to consider raising his number to the rafters. Right now, they're among the top teams in the NHL, number 1 in the Eastern Conference. So we'll see what the spring brings. Whether
We need that cup.
Right. I mean, it's 30 years, the karma, right? 30th anniversary. They also went to the final 10 years ago. So we'll see what happens. But I think they have as good a chance as anybody. And Chris Kreider has certainly been, I would say, at this point, one of the top. There are a lot of numbers hang from the rafters, but you have to consider him as one of the top, I would say, 10 to 12 players at this point in franchise history.
Well, we got to get Bilal to a Rangers game because I'm still trying to get him into hockey. I'm a huge hockey fan. And Chris Kreider, he's the one athlete still because he came up when I was in high school. So I still kind of have that younger self, like that childish way of how I look at him. My view obviously has changed as you get older. And obviously, from being in the industry, how you view athletes is different. And the one guy who's still playing, who I still view kind of with that same childish mindset, I guess, is Chris Kreider. So that's special to me. Again, thank you so much for the time. We really appreciate it. A Mike for All Seasons is the book, and then you could hear Kenny. Basically, if you're watching any sports game, there's like a 50% chance he's calling the game. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Rami. Thanks, Bilal. Really enjoyed watching you during your career, calling some of your games. Good luck with the podcast, and hopefully we can do it again in the future.
Thanks for joining us, Kenny.
Thanks, guys.
All right, coming back. Thank you so much again to the great Kenny Albert for that awesome conversation. Really enjoyed it. The Jets have a football game tonight, Thursday Night Football, so they're not going to ruin our Sunday this week, Bilal. They can't ruin New Year's Day or New Year's Eve, rather. So the Jets have a game. They're plus 7.5. The game doesn't really matter in Cleveland. The last time the Jets played in Cleveland, Joe Flacco led a 13-point comeback in the last minute and 55 seconds of the game for the Jets to win that game. So now Joe Flacco naturally is facing the Jets in Cleveland, plus 7.5. Do you have any prediction or anything to say about this game?
No,
Doesn't matter.
I just want to see them win. I mean, at the end of the day, turning on the game, I want to see these guys go out and play hard. Like, we talked about Makai and his effort. Like, you can't put that on film. So you want to see this organization fight. I want to see this team do two things. One of two things. All right. If we get down, I want to see them fight back and show that they have fight. And I want to see, and if they get up, I want to see them finish. That's what I want to see this team do Thursday night. Or tonight,
it's tonight, and it's twofold because this team is a team that we know everyone's coming back next year, so there's no point in tanking now. I don't think there's any point to that. I think you're not trying to get one of those top quarterbacks. I'd love one of those top 3 tackles in the draft. But the point is, like, I think it's time where we got to see what this coaching staff is made of. So don't tank. Win a divisional game against New England. Break that streak next week. We'll talk about it next week, I'm sure, again. But tonight, find a way to win this game. Find a way to be competitive. Don't roll over and just die, because you're fighting for next year. You're building that winning culture that Aaron Rodgers was talking about. So one last thing, there's another implication if you are watching football this week. I think it's this week. Let me look it up. I got to look up the schedule. I should have done this before we start recording. This is so unprofessional of me, Bilal. Yeah, there's an implication based on, I think the Bears and the Packers play one more time. And based on that result, it's going to determine where the Jets play next season. And they're either going to play a road game in Chicago which Aaron Rodgers wants to do, or, well, it's Green Bay and Minnesota this week. So the next couple of weeks, if you're rooting for something, I would say you should root for Green Bay to finish with a slightly better record than Chicago. And they finish third in their division, because the Jets are going to finish third in the AFC East. So that means that the Jets go to Lambeau next year and Aaron Rodgers goes back to Lambeau. I want to see that. I wanted them to put it on a Monday night in December when it's freezing and you have Joe and Troy on the call and Aaron Rodgers going back to Lambeau. That would be freaking awesome. But that's yeah, so the Packers are playing this week against Minnesota and next week against Chicago. So definitely keep an eye out for those games.
Yeah, and honestly, you talk about that primetime game. Hopefully, they're winning next year, and you look forward to something. You have to look forward to it. Like, if we're not winning, and you know, who knows what the season may look like at that time. But hopefully, they're winning, and you look forward to that. But you know, I remember when Michael Vick came to New York, and we went to Philly, and the standing ovation that he had was unbelievable. And you know, Marty Morningwig was the offensive coordinator, and he looked at Gino. He said, "Hey, you know, we're gonna start Mike. Just one snap, it's a handoff, and then you know you get back in." And the standing ovation that he got in Philly was insane. It was insane. Now I want to see what would it look like. Would it be boos? Would it be cheers? Like, what you always ask yourself that when a quarterback goes and plays their old team, and you all sitting in on some of those game plans when you know a guy's playing his old club, you make him a captain, you make sure that you put him in the best position to, you know, to be successful versus old organization. So, you know, I would love to be a fly on the wall when you talk about game plan, what Aaron would be thinking if he had that opportunity, and what the feeling would be like for him walking back in Lambeau, what the energy would feel like for the Packer fans. They may get the standing ovation, but it may be the loudest game ever in that stadium, just rooting against that guy. So, you know, that'd be something that's interesting.
Yeah, something to look forward to. I'm looking forward to next year because I do think it could be successful, and I don't want to be negative anymore. And I want to see them win. I want to see Rodgers be successful here. Speaking of next year, New Year's this weekend. So happy New Year's. If I don't speak to you before then, I'm sure we'll recap the game next week. Yeah, and that's pretty much all I got, other than send my love to the league MVP, Lamar Jackson, baby.
Oh, yeah, Lamar.
I love it. You told me you have a personal relationship with him. I'm like, when was this going to come up? Because I work down there and I'm obsessed with him.
Yeah, man, Lamar's cool, man. He's cool. He's laid back and, you know, down to earth. You know, he's one of those guys. If he signs one autograph for a kid, he's probably gonna sign it for every kid that's standing over there. So, you know, he's very down to earth. I've always said it since he got in the league. You know, when they were criticizing, oh, he's not our quarterback. He's a receiver. He's a running back. The guy has been probably one of the most consistent quarterbacks in his career, in his class. I think he's a front runner for the MVP right now.
Same.
I honestly do. We saw that when he went against the 49ers, what he did, and he's been doing it, man. You gotta, you know, you have to give him his flowers and his respect. And, you know, obviously they are one of the best teams in the league right now. And I do think they're going to contend for a Super Bowl this year.
Yep. All right. Well, I appreciate you, boss. I'll talk to you next year, which hopefully next week. Happy holidays to you and your family. Until next time, I'll see you, buddy. All right.
All right, man. Have a good one.